All right, and Daniel Meister joins me now from St. John, New Brunswick. Daniel, how you doing today?
I am very well. How are you, Sean?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much
Good.
for being here and for putting up with me mispronouncing your name three times.
That's
Uh, so,
perfectly
uh,
fine.
very excited to talk about the book. As I said in the intro, it's called The Racial Mosaic, A Prehistory of Canadian Multiculturalism. And let's get started by looking at what the basic parameters of this book are, because I think a lot of folks might come to it with some suppositions about what you're going to be writing about or what they're going to be reading about when they come to a book about multiculturalism, especially a book that says prehistory of multiculturalism. So for anyone who's coming to it, what's the era that you're talking about, and how do you actually define the prehistory of multiculturalism for a country that, for as long as there have been people here, there have been different cultural aspects to it. Like there have been different cultures, different languages, different forms of religion, music, all that. Like it's always been a multicultural place. So how do you get to a prehistory of that?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So when we talk about multiculturalism, a lot of people want to talk about 1971 and Pierre Trudeau's announcement when he introduced this as an official policy. But people that look at multiculturalism typically point out that the term's actually defined in a number of ways. So we talk about, sociological multiculturalism, or like the fact of diversity. We also talk about the ideology, like the idea that it's okay and it's possible for different groups to live together in harmony in the same country, and perhaps even desirable. And then we also talk about in the third sense of it being a government policy. So the term prehistory is not exactly, common to everyone. And I'm not talking about some, like really ancient era, but what I mean by that is it's before the era of official multiculturalism. So obviously the policy begins in 71, but what influenced the history of this policy? So what were the ideas behind it, and where did they come from? And so I talk a bit about how, Trudeau himself kind of makes a couple mentions of, different metaphors and ways of thinking about diversity that were developed, much before 71, but actually, and so the focus of the book is on this earlier period, which is primarily like the interwar period. And a lot of the ideas about diversity emerge from the debates about immigration during this era.
Now, the book also talks about the idea of cultural pluralism, the notion that immigrants should be allowed or even encouraged to retain some aspects of their culture. Is that the most accurate way to define cultural pluralism? And how do you use that term? Because that comes up a lot even today as people look at Canada, the way in which immigrants are welcomed into this country, or in some cases not welcomed into this country.
Mhm.
Is that the best way to define pluralism, particularly cultural pluralism?
Yeah, so for in this period, I think that is the kind of the best way of coming at it. And one of the things I try to stress in the book is that, I am, retrospectively going back and looking at these ideas that these different public intellectuals were expressing, were writing about, and thinking about. But one of the things is important to remember is there isn't some sort of a unified, movement towards pluralism. In this period, there's these kind of independent efforts by different individuals. So when we talk about pluralism, a lot of them are expressing somewhat different ideas. That term actually, cultural pluralism, is used, but not that frequently. But really, they're just talking about this idea that when immigrants come to Canada, it's okay for them to maintain some of the cultures of their homeland. Um, and the degree to which they should be allowed to do this, or what elements of culture should be retained, was still the subject of quite heated debate. And I think there's three main public intellectuals I examine in the book, and each of them had slightly different ideas about this.
Mhm. I think one of the cool ways to even think about it is it's like every 4 years. I guess maybe every two or three, because the women's World Cup is different from the men's World Cup. It's on a different rotation. It's every 4 years, but it's
Mm,
like you have like one was right after the other, and you have a couple years off or whatever it is. But during those soccer World Cups, men's and women's, you see lots of flags around, right? Even
yeah.
in the women, when the Canada's playing, you still see a lot of English, German, uh, or South American flag. Like there's just flags from all over the world that fly during
Hmm.
World Cup. I'm very curious if the men's team qualifies for the men's World Cup this year, if they'll
Yeah.
if that will change the dynamic at all. But is that just
Mm.
one example of cultural pluralism? The idea that, hey, yeah, fly the flag where your family came from or you have a connection to during a sporting event. Is that just like one small manifestation, and maybe an anecdote that people can say, oh yeah, that's what that is, and it's okay for people to do that?
Yeah, and I think especially in a modern day, that's what we would think about as these expressions of cultural identity. And in this earlier period, there was a much greater concern about to what degree culture was expressed, because in some cases, and especially like in the West and in block settlements, the dominant or the primary language wasn't necessarily English. It could be Ukrainian or another language, and so there was a lot of concern about how how far is this going, or is this dangerous to Canada? And so a lot of the aspects of culture that were deemed acceptable for immigrants to maintain during this period actually related a lot to ideas about folk culture. So poetry and songs, dance, festivals, things like that, that were viewed as kind of, in a way, harmless, to Canada, but also like meaningful, artistic and kind of cultural displays. And the idea over time was not only that this was beneficial for the immigrants to maintain, but this was actually something beneficial for the nation as a whole. And so, this idea about folk really, I think, influences all the way to 71, especially with a lot of the early efforts that actually occur under multiculturalism. So this is one of the things, and it's interesting you bring up flags too, because there's such a debate about to what degree politics should stay out of it, the politics of the homeland, and so this becomes obviously, very contentious during the Second World War about, you can keep different aspects of culture, but like let's leave politics at the door type of idea, and I think that in a way this also kind of defines the post-war era as well, and the Cold War. You could obviously see an increasing focus on that. But again, that's kind of just a little bit outside of the scope of the book.
Yeah, and that's another thing though that relates to today when you're talking about immigration and people concerned, certain people concerned that, oh, if we bring more immigrants will mean problems from other places will migrate here with them, and that's
Hmm.
it's just sort of one of those talking points that come up when people who are anti-immigration uh, tend to argue against it. It's that type of an argument. But what's also curious too, and the book does talk about this, that you're talking about cultural outlets and in particular dance, and the book starts with an anecdote from Lisgar Collegiate in the post-war
Hmm.
period, which is literally like 2 blocks from where I am currently sitting. Lisgar,
Okay.
Lisgar Collegiate, and it's a dance that the women's athletic team is doing from different countries all over the world. But it's curious that this is also an era where things like the potlatch are still outlawed, and there's still concerns about
Hmm.
indigenous culture and the expression of indigenous culture across the country. So how does the cultural pluralism that you're talking about in the book, which is very much focused on European cultures, how does that conflict with or maybe even perhaps how does it support the colonial project of Canada at this time? And how do you address that dynamic over the course of the book?
Yeah. So, fundamentally, this project is settler colonial one, right? It's the dominant colonial group, broadly like Anglo Canadians, debating who should be allowed to come here and what they should be allowed to do once they're here. The people that were already here and were here long before, they're really excluded from consideration, altogether. And so, in fact, right, like what really triggers a lot of these foundational debates is increasing immigration in the interwar period, which was this drive to, quote, settle the West, right? And so, yeah, as you point out, during the same time period, indigenous ceremonies and traditions are actively being banned, and there's an ongoing state level attempt to suppress cultural expression and really eradicate it through residential schools. So these two things are like very opposite ends of the pole. Where one, there's no sign of this relenting, that they are really, the state is really trying to eliminate indigenous cultures. On the other hand, there's this like growing awareness among the Canadian public that a lot of immigrants have these rich cultural backgrounds, and we should allow them to come here. So they are intertwined and part of the same project. They're driven by a lot of the same forces and ideas about race and culture. And and one of the curious things, of course, is the involvement of John Murray Gibbon, who is really, in a romantic at heart and really in love with Western Canada. And some of the events that he puts on there do involve some Indigenous peoples. But again, like, their involvement is very limited. The descriptions are very, essentialistic, paternalistic, racist. And as we see with the folk festivals in Quebec, ultimately they're cut out for the second, the second time this is put on. So, Gibbon is willing to entertain some inclusion of Indigenous cultures, or at least like certain aspects of them, or perhaps stereotypical descriptions of them. But at the same time, that's very limited. And his correspondence shows that he's keenly aware of the Department of Indian Affairs disapproval of anything like that. And so, in some instances, he tries to lay out, this is why we can do it, or this is how we can do it, but we can't exceed that. So, you know, to it's very obvious that this is an explicit process, right? That this isn't just something that's happening without a thought, but Gibbon realizes he's kind of pushing the boundaries and what's acceptable and what's not. And what's interesting, right, is that all the Gibbon and Robert England and Watson Kirkconnell, the other figures that I examine, they're all keenly aware of the cultures that they are excluding, but they don't really make any effort, any significant effort to bring them in. There's always this return focus to European immigrants only.
Right. So you mentioned the three individuals who you study: Watson Kirkconnell, Robert England, and John Murray Gibbon. And obviously, the key elements in the discussion that kind of boils down everything to race. And before we get
Mm-hmm.
into the three of them particularly, let's just quickly define race in this time, because the term today, the way it's used today, I think is different from the way they would term race, or the way race was identified back in the interwar period. And this is one of the hardest things that I have found when you're talking with students, that race today doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. Like, I would argue that today race is defined almost exclusively in sort of shorthand as your outward race, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to necessarily place of origin. But how do you define it in the book, and how, more importantly, did they define it in the moment?
Yeah, so one of the things, the book in the introduction, like moves quite quickly from the story of Lisgar to like this very intense and kind of dark topic of scientific racism. But the reason for that is I was, the way I came to the topic and through studying Kirkconnell is one of the first, lengthy primary documents I'm, confronting in the archives is this sort of racial history of North America and of Canada, laying out quite explicitly the reasons for this history and how they're all tied back to race, which really was jarring to me in my knowledge of the historiography, or at least what I had been taught so far as an undergraduate student, about race and scientific racism, and especially, right, this idea of Canada versus the States, and that this kind of an American problem. But here's someone very explicitly laying out their ideas about race. So in this period, race is believed to be a scientific reality, that the world is divided into people of different races, that these differences are physical, but they also influence the cultural expressions, and not just that there was a divide between quote white and non-white people, but actually people of European descent could also be classified according to their specific race. So, the main way of thinking about this divided Europeans into three racial groups: the Nordic, Mediterranean, and Alpine. Um, and over time, there was a belief, originally people really wanted to have, clear lines between who belonged to what race and what race corresponded roughly with what nation. And then a lot of these folks who still, clung to the idea that race was a reality began to believe that, well, maybe there had been more mixing over time than we previously thought. But still, if you see different expressions of culture or different, physical characteristics, these actually correspond to this older sort of ancient race. And so for them, it was a very scientific thing that they believed, even though we know now, and at the time, still the evidence was very scanty, and there was people actively arguing against it. But the position that they held was that race was something scientific. So it determined everything. It determined how you looked. It determined how you acted, what your culture would be like, what your possibilities were, where you could live in the world. It was really an incredibly powerful idea. Baseless, but
Sure.
incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and you see this around the world too. This isn't just a Canadian phenomenon, North American phenomenon. You see it everywhere where there are multiracial communities. And I've studied in the Caribbean, and the history of the Caribbean, of course, is very much defined by race. Not only the European origin, African origin, those who were there before the indigenous communities there. Like it very much becomes defined by race. But what's interesting
Hmm.
to me is this is happening in the backdrop of the aftermath of the First World War, where you see during the war a lot of the colonial troops on the Allied side who are coming from India, for instance. They are
Hmm.
racialized in the popular literature at the time and the propaganda at the time. Even the British propaganda is racializing people who are fighting on their own side. And then after the war, you start to see this idea that, oh, like the Brits did it, and like we it was us, like the British and the French. They ignore a lot of the contributions of their colonial troops in the
Hmm.
aftermath. In the Canadian context, that you see that a little bit with the French troops, but certainly with non-white troops, their contributions
Hmm.
get completely ignored in a lot of the literature and a lot of the celebration that happens after the war. So how much of what you see in this book is a product of that post-war period, this idea of celebrating Canada that comes out of it, trying to make sense of what happened in the war? You see a lot of national clubs be created in that period. Like
Hmm.
is there any sort of correlation between this nationalism of the 1920s and the cultural pluralism that you're seeing in this era?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's interesting that each of the individuals that I look at in the book had a different experience of the First World War, and that to some degree really influenced the way that they approach this whole question of diversity in Canada. So Watson Kirkconnell, one of the great ironies of his life is that he's really recognized for his translation efforts, particularly with European languages, and he received a host of awards, from various countries during his life. He was honored for his work with Ukrainian literature and Polish literature and also Icelandic literature, and the list goes on. But how he gets his first involvement with these groups is he works as an internment guard during the First World War. So when a lot of predominantly Ukrainians and also Germans and some other groups who were rounded up into camps, he was one of the ones sent to watch over them, and he does this at Fort Henry in Kingston, and then at Kapuskasing in Ontario. And because and here's another irony of one of these people writing these great eugenic tracts about the fit and the unfit. He is declared unfit for service. He tries his hand at going 3 times. He's rejected 3 times. 3 medical boards say, nope, you're not strong enough to go. But internment operations was continually understaffed, and so off he went. And he develops this very negative, condescending and patronizing attitude towards Ukrainian Canadians during this period. And it's only much later that he kind of reverses course on this. Robert England, on the other hand, is this Irish immigrant who comes to Canada, and then shortly after he arrives, the First World War breaks out, and he ships out. And he, very explicitly talks about his experience in his memoirs, and he also publishes another booklet about his military service shortly before his death. And he just says, working with all these people of all these different nationalities, like, how could you put one down after that when they've done such a service in helping you? And, we were all fighting for this one cause. So he has this very sort of unifying experience, whereas for Connell, it's very divisive for him. Um, And notably though, for both of them, neither is talking about people racialized as non-white. It's still kind of this pan-European experience, or consideration that they're thinking about. And Gibbon is not involved in fighting the war. He does, I believe, some patriotic efforts during this period, but he's not actively involved in it. But in the post-war era, when there's this kind of immigration boom and there's more diversity that people start to fret about, these individuals are drawing on those experiences of the war, and as kind of a key way of understanding what's going on. And so Robert England, he goes to teach in this Ukrainian school district in Saskatchewan, but again, like, even though he shares some concerns about block settlements and Ukrainian communities, I think some of what keeps him from getting into the worst excesses of the kind of xenophobia and racism in this period is that he has this experience in the back of his mind of working with and fighting alongside all these people of other nationalities and cultures.
So why is it that these three guys who you've identified and you just talked about a little of their backstory and their experience during the war, why are they such good individuals to focus on to tell this story? I was very taken when I was going through the book about how you define historical biography, the case you make for why you take this approach in the book. But what is it about these three guys that make them such good figures for you to study to be able to tell this particular story?
Yeah, well, isn't that always the question, right? With biography or biographies, is like, why? Who cares? Why is it this one person that we should be looking at? Or in this case, three. And even the expansion to three was in part because of concern about just studying one life is a bit too narrow, which is not a position I agree with. But in any case, looking at this particular you know aspect of Canadian history, as I said, at the beginning, like this wasn't really a formal movement. There was no sort of a club that they all belonged to. So if we want to understand some of these very early pushes for more tolerant approaches to European cultures in Canada, at least, excuse me, we have to look at who's actually involved, and these three are really the only ones who are pushing, at least from this sort of broadly Anglo-Canadian perspective, for more tolerant attitudes. And in the historiography, they have been identified previously, but not really. Their contributions haven't really been dwelt on in any significant way. In Kirkconnell's case, a lot of the previous biographical writing that's done is very much celebratory. There's no critical aspect. And Robert England has largely been overlooked. And John Murray Gibbon, of course, everybody knows Canadian Mosaic, but his papers kind of scattered to the winds after his death, and so it's much harder to reconstruct his life and thought. But looking at their contributions, or it's kind of easy to see that why they would have been at the forefront, or being able to garner the most attention during this period, because two of them were working for railroads, which are the ones pushing for more immigration in Canada in the first place. So obviously there's sort of a vested interest there, besides whatever personal feelings they may have about it. And Kirkconnell really is one of the first people to do this sort of translation work, and he does it. Kirkconnell wants to get famous. There's no two ways about it. He really is seeking kind of academic recognition for his work, but at the same time, it also did a service, for European immigrants, of bringing their cultures to the attention of Anglo Canadians who might otherwise not be aware of them. So, in terms of their contributions, I think they are really some of the main people, and so that's why I focused on them. And interestingly, in the book, there's not a lot of discussion of the dynamics between them, but the reason for that, it really just highlights how individual their efforts were. That this really wasn't some sort of a combined effort. The only time that they start to come together is at the end during the Second World War, when the state begins to ask for their expertise in developing some sort of program to reach out to folks. But that's towards the very end.
Yeah, and I find that pretty interesting as someone who studied the CBC, sort of the dynamics of how the government tries to involve itself in unity, trying to create a sense of unity during the Second World War. But before we get into that, I want to go back to something that you wrote about historical biography, and I can't remember if it was your quote or not, if you were citing somebody else. Where you noted that the shift to a more social history, or not to more, but to, more people are doing social history than were doing social history 40 years ago, that certainly that's been a good thing. It's been able to tell stories that were previously untold, but to tell the story of the state and these ideas, you can't just tell the story of the disenfranchised, but you have to tell the story of those who were part of the institutional power at the time. So, how do you relate these three guys to that institutional power, to state power? They're not necessarily individuals who are holding office. They're not people who are the leaders of any major political party or anything like that. So, how do you fit those guys into this discussion of those who are disenfranchised versus those who hold institutional power? Where do they fit within this dynamic?
Yeah, and it is an uneasy one, and it's a bit ambiguous. So there's a couple senses in which I'm, drawing on that kind of distinction, and the first is in terms of, back to what we are talking about, ideas about race and whiteness. There's a people that are actively being, negatively racialized as non-white, and how that affects them, but also, and it goes without saying, it's extremely important to understand the consequences of these ideas for the people that they affected. But also, in order to understand the full context, we also need to understand, who are coming up with these ideas, how are they, and as you said, these are global ideas, but how are they being picked up and adopted to particular national context? So I see, these three figures as very influential in that sense, in the terms of the ideas about race, modifying these predominantly Anglo-American ideas about race is a lot of what they're drawing on, and then putting them to work in the Canadian context, trying to define who and who is not white, or who is and is not superior Anglo-Saxon or what have you, depending on kind of what lens they're taking. So that's one sense. And the question about state power is one that I struggled with too, especially trying to draw the line between what was an unofficial attempt and what was an official attempt to promote cultural pluralism, because as the case with the CBC, it's complex, right? This is part of the state. At the same time, I don't know how really micromanaged it was at this period, right? Like, so I don't have anyone at the top saying like, we need more content about European immigrants, but at the same time, the people responsible for choosing content said like, this is interesting, I want some of this, let's have a program about it. So that's one question. Another question, of course, is the relationship between railways and the state, because in some cases it's difficult to discern whose interests are really at work here, right? Like, they're so tightly bound together, and there's even in the story of how England comes to get his job at the Canadian National Railways, there's such an revolving door of people in the immigration department, and then also into these various the two main railways. So also in that sense, mostly what they're exerting is kind of corporate power, but at the same time, it's so tied up with the state in this period, I'm not sure you can fully really disentangle them. So they have an immense amount of power behind them from a corporate perspective, and so I think that's very significant to understanding their position. And then Kirkconnell, a lot of his was this kind of prestige he had from being affiliated with universities, and then this increasing international recognition. And it's almost a case of kind of like mastering the field by creating the field or something, right? Like, he just,
Yeah.
he's the only guy doing it, and he says, I'm the expert here, and who is going to argue with him? I think that people from the various groups he was translating might have taken exception with some of the things he was saying about them. But again, one of the key critiques of Kirkconnell, both in his life and afterwards, is this kind of blindness to class of what people he was looking at, and then who was actually going to be reading the stuff that he was turning out too, right? Yeah, so his authority was slightly different, and he had a difficult relationship with the state, to put it mildly, because he's such a fervent anti-communist, and that is so unacceptable, especially in this earlier period. And so when England, Gibbon, and Connell all kind of get drawn up into more official attempts to promote pluralism in the Second World War, then it's an uneasy alliance and it doesn't last very long. And Connell was definitely the most ideologically driven of the three of them, and so he has a very strained relationship. England is, he's a classic kind of he knows how things work, and he avoids these sort of politics, and he in the end is the one that gets called in to kind of clean things up. And Gibbon had so much on the go, and his primary responsibility was to his company, still in this period, so he doesn't get too involved in controversies. He's like Mr. Folk Festival. Everybody knows what he's done, and it's incredible, but at the same time that's not something that's going to work for wartime. So yeah, it's interesting. They all start as individual efforts, and Gibbon, it's clear, he kind of comes up with this on his own, because he's interested in folk cultures and in the West, and then he sells it to the company as a way of doing publicity, and it works, so he's allowed to keep doing it. So kind of personal and corporate, and then later there's involvement with the state. But as I say, the radio efforts, and even some of the early war efforts where the government tries to hide their involvement, it's kind of a question of how official is it, or to what degree do people know this is actually a state initiated effort.
Yeah, and certainly the radio stuff is interesting for me. Is that's sort of my area of CBC in this time, and one of the things that stands out is that they really fought any state intrusion. Anytime any like C.D. Howe was the one who was trying to exercise the most influence, but frankly the only thing he was kind of successful on was getting hockey games from Thunder Bay broadcast into Ottawa so that he could hear them. But for the most part, they really did try to fight it and just get people to listen to Canadian stuff, or stuff that was made in Canada, or even
Mhm.
stations in Canada if they were airing American stuff. So it was this interesting dynamic at play there. But as you mentioned, once you get into the late 1930s and of course into the 1940s, there's a renewed push towards unity, right? The King and the Queen come in
Mhm.
1939. That's broadcast all across the country. The Spanish Civil War, as we've talked about on this show before, is a bit of a flashpoint when we're talking about the idea of
Mhm.
Canadian unity. So how do these guys respond to the late 1930s and into the war? And is the reaction to them being more positive from the state potentially, or even just from the wider Canadian public? Are these changes, when you're talking about the racial science and all that, like is there just a practical side of it that everyone, not everyone, a lot of people, right, anyone who is over the age of 25 had lived through and would remember the First World War and what happened then? And with the world on the precipice of war again, how much of the change in social attitudes is a practical response to the fact that it is likely there's going to be another conflict and we will need to respond in some way?
Yeah, right before the war, Connell goes on a trip to Europe, and he tours around, and he pays for it by doing a series of newspaper articles. He's supposed to get an honorary degree, and he teaches a summer course in Hungary. And so he is acutely aware of what's going on. He has a lot of concerns by the time he gets back, and he goes in 38. And so when he gets back, he's kind of primed that something's going to happen here. And so I think, in a way, is, I mean, I don't have definitive proof of this, but I think he's angling to be involved in the state effort. He wants to be part of, the effort on the home front. And Robert England, who is a First World War veteran, he also recognized something was up. Unless he's kind of painting a rosier picture after the fact, but in his memoirs he talks about, he had taken a job at UBC. He wasn't paid a lot. He was doing the extension work, or kind of distance and adult learning, and he says, well, there's a war coming, and I know this, and I want to be able to do a greater part, but like I've got no money, and I'm over here on the West Coast, so I need to make a change. And so he takes a job, and moves to Winnipeg, and he gets a much higher salary, and of course then he is involved in some of these wartime efforts, with to promote cultural pluralism. And Gibbon, for his part, he just keeps chugging along what he's doing at the CPR. But of course, they make their own corporate contribution to the war. But this is a belatedly, all of a sudden the government realizes, like, we need to be paying attention to ethnic minorities in Canada. At the same time, it's not like it's same as these individuals are kind of acting on their own independently early on. So in the state, it's not this kind of concerted movement towards it. It's not Mackenzie King doesn't come up with this one day. Like, there's various people in various departments bringing this matter up, and oftentimes not having a lot of luck in getting anything done, until finally they say, okay, we'll put together this advisory body that can give departments information about ethnic minorities. And so then afterwards they start to kind of draw on these experts and have some work done. But again, it's kind of debatable about how successful they were, or really what they're able to get done. So in a way, I see it not so much as an echo of the previous war having an influence here, although certainly on some of the individuals involved, but kind of this belated recognition of, like, these kind of questions that were raised in the First World War about unity and the way some groups were treated, and then the debates that were triggered about immigration in the interwar period never really went away. Right, there was never any
Mhm.
definitive, resolving of these questions. And so, if our national unity is going to be tried again, like, these are some obvious weak points that we need to address here, and so we should do that. And a large part of that, right, was convincing Anglo Canadians that these other groups would be loyal. That was, like, the primary concern. They didn't want internal division because of concerns about patriotism. So they wanted to convince all the so-called native-born Canadians that immigrants were going to be loyal and everything was going to be okay. So it's interesting that even this these efforts, which are supposed to be about these other cultural groups, aren't really about them, in the sense of, they're not reaching out to these groups. They're kind of reaching out to Anglo Canadians and saying, these people are okay. And then, as time goes on, you also see more of an effort then also to say, oh, if you're an immigrant and you have strong political views, like, let's not bring those up right now. Like, this is not the time for it. Just be quiet and be nice. And then after the war, maybe we can talk about these things. And that, almost that degree of that tone and everything is present, especially in some of Connell's writings.
Yeah, and you see it again if you look at the radio example. One of the first things the CBC does is ban non-English or French programming on any station. Right,
Hmm.
CBC is the regulator
Yeah.
at the time. They say no to anything, and that's a pretty clear sign to these communities that, oh, maybe we don't actually trust you right
Yeah, not a lot of subtlety in these
now. No,
actions right away, right?
no, no.
Yeah.
But again, with so many, with as many German, Italian, Ukrainian, other Eastern European immigrants that you see during the interwar period, this is a sizable portion of the population. Right? It's not an insignificant
Mhm.
group of people who you are potentially either offending, or at the very least you're making them feel othered by doing
Mhm.
that, by saying, oh, your first language is not acceptable here. Right, it's as you say, it's
Yeah.
not subtle. A very clear sign in a time where you need unity. Right, the war
Mhm.
demands that everyone is on the same page, because it is a total war. Even if you're not going to serve, there is a role for you somewhere, or at least the nation
Yeah.
state would have you believe there is a role for you somewhere. So
Mhm.
again, there's that practical side to it. But in the same time, like, how much do you think the war and the work of these three guys really does cue up what we see in the post-war period and then leading into 1971? Like, how influential are they? How influential is this era? We talked at the start that this is the title of the book is Prehistory of Canadian
Mhm.
Multiculturalism. Can we draw that line to 1971 from this era and from the work that these guys are doing?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think I would be remiss just not to point out quickly that there's also, and I should have mentioned this in the my answer before, but it's also so obvious that the influence of race in this idea, in this period rather, is still going to be influential. So you can see such a marked difference in how European groups are treated versus how Japanese Canadians are treated. And this is apparent right from the outset, where, internal documents saying, well, Europeans and different groups here, like, we can kind of judge them on a case by case basis. Whereas, right from the earliest days, people are saying, like, it might be necessary that we round up all the Japanese in Canada and put them into camps. So, these ideas about race continue to percolate and really affect policy decisions in this period. On your other question, like, in one sense, I want to say, that I ended the book where I did, like, for a reason, because I'm still doing this research and trying to figure out the answer to these questions. And, like, everyone wants to know about 71, and then about the, like, 20s, 30s, 40s is kind of like, oh, that was a long time ago. And you don't have, like, the sexy leader like Trudeau who's coming out and making everything really interesting, right? So there's no Trudeau mania in the 30s and 40s, and it's just kind of this, we have Mackenzie King. So less exciting. Everyone wants to talk about 71. I do have some initial thoughts though about it. First, like, there's a branch in the historiography that talks about the bureaucracy for multiculturalism. So, the Committee on Cooperation and Canadian Citizenship, the CCCC, and the Nationalities Branch, which is a part of that. These bodies, although they are not really successful and don't do that much, that this kind of developing this bureaucracy does have some tangible effects. And so when when the war ends and these organizations are kind of wound down, they actually continue on their work with the creation of the citizenship branch. And the citizenship branch, in gatekeepers that find book on this period, we see that they are still doing a lot of work and trying to help welcome immigrants, and still a lot of these ideas of um, about to what degree immigrants' cultures could be a contribution. So sharing recipes and things like this that are viewed as non-threatening aspects of culture, we can share that with all the Canadians. So that one organization continues to do a lot of that work. And Lee Blanding's unpublished PhD dissertation talks a lot about how that bureaucracy continues. And so he makes the argument that Trudeau announces this brand new policy, but really in practice, what's happening is a lot of these pre-existing programs that the citizenship folks are doing are just rebranded multiculturalism, and off they go. So, in a sense, from a public policy perspective, there is a pretty direct line, this scholarship would argue, from the late 40s, 50s through the 70s. And the one, argument about these connections that I've tentatively made or suggested in the book is just the influence of the ideas themselves, right? So, Trudeau very intentionally invokes the Mosaic metaphor when he's before this gathering of Ukrainian Canadians, because that's become so important. And I think expanding on that, also the work of these three public intellectuals kind of laid the groundwork for communities like this to retain a sense of their identity. So, obviously they're not like 100% responsible, but in creating this environment or contributing to this environment in which communities are encouraged to retain aspects of their cultures, and in which Anglo Canadians are encouraged, to accept this and to view it as positive, they kind of created a circumstance in which the pride in one's ethnic identity can be fostered. And so I think in part this can be argued as contributing to that sense of identity that led Ukrainian Canadians in particular to push back against the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, which suggested that there were, like, quite literally only two cultural groups in Canada, and for them to say, like, oh, hold up, there's plenty of other cultural groups in Canada, and they shouldn't be written out as unofficial. And what's interesting to me is the degree to which ideas about settler colonialism continue to be bound up in this process. So, from the earliest moments of cultural pluralism, which, as I've argued, is really kind of an integral part of this project. But later on, one of the key arguments that Ukrainian Canadians in particular make is that they deserve recognition as a founding race, which is still the language being used in this period, which is, noteworthy. But they're a founding race because of all the work they did on the West. They said, like, it's not British settlers who are the ones that settled the West. We came out and kind of did all the work. We built the railways, we settled these villages, and so that this is our work, and now it's being minimized by this royal commission. We take objection with that. And so, Trudeau is quite obviously responding to these concerns when he introduces this policy, and then the very next day flies down and gives this speech to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. So I think there's a number of ways in which the work of these early public intellectuals contributes to this later history of multiculturalism. At the same time, and why I use the term prehistory is I don't, I'm kind of working against the trend of saying, of blending those definitions of multiculturalism and saying, like, because Canada was always sociologically multicultural, it's always been ideologically multicultural, when obviously, for most of, all of this period, really exclusion and discrimination are the norm. Um, Even when we look at European groups, but especially if we look at the treatment of non-Europeans who are completely left out of this early effort, and really aren't the focus of the policy of multiculturalism when it's introduced. This is William Licka said, this is a movement that's a policy that's demanded by and designed for European groups in 1971. Scholars have argued that there is a turn towards embracing kind of anti-racist goals, maybe in the mid 70s or early 80s. But again, like, it's noteworthy that this isn't one of the foundational goals here. This is about responding to this, kind of blunder in this Royal Commission of suggesting that, there's only two cultural groups in Canada, which, looking at the diversity of Indigenous cultures in Canada before colonization is, obviously an absurd idea. But again, the Commission really struggled with how to exclude Indigenous peoples from consideration, and they were able to do so by saying, they weren't part of the terms of reference. So to me, I'm not suggesting that 71 is the same as 21 or anything like that, but I think that there is a lot of continuity of ideas, of discourse. The language is still the founding races in the B&B Commission. The focus is still on European groups. The metaphors being bandied about are, still the same, tapestry and mosaic. So there are a lot of continuities in terms of ideas about race, diversity, and still the project of settler colonialism.
Right. And it's one of those things too that we focus so much in history, and certainly popular history, about those benchmarks, things like 1971. We focus on that without looking at all the groundwork that had been laid. It's not just that, oh, one day in 1971 we decide, oh, let's do this thing. Right? There's
Yeah.
a lot that goes into it, and that's why books like this are so important and so interesting to go through as you lay out the groundwork through the story of these three individuals. So again, it's The Racial Mosaic, a prehistory of Canadian multiculturalism. So Daniel, if people are interested in the book or some of the other work that you're doing, what's the best way for them to pick it up and maybe reach out?
Yeah, so the book is published by McGill Queen's University Press, so it's available directly from them on their website, or hopefully you can order through an independent local bookstore. And then I'm on Twitter. My handle is history_meister, so you can find me there and send me a message, and I'd be happy to talk about the book with you or your class, or help you get your hands on a copy.
I and certainly would encourage everybody to check it out. So Daniel Meister, thank you so much for joining me all the way from St. John on a Saturday, no less. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Well, thanks very much, Shauna, for the kind words.